Hello to Susan, Cindy, Jen, and April. It was wonderful to see you all yesterday in class. And Susan, it was particularly nice to finally meet you. We've been in classes together for about a year and a half now, and it was nice to finally meet you via something other than WebEx. In looking at each of your posts, I enjoyed hearing all of them and learning a little bit more about the research that you all plan to do as part of this course. And I did have some comments and some questions with regard to some of your research, and some of that does apply to yesterday's leadership conference that we all attended. So to start off with, I did find it interesting that Susan, Cindy, April, and I are really all, to some extent, looking at student preparation as some part of our research study. And while this was definitely included in the readings, it wasn't one of the number one components. There was so much about once students are actually on campus, about the support networks they form and the way that content is provided to them and all of that. So I found it interesting that 4 of the 5 of us are really focusing, at least to some extent, on preparation before students actually arrive on campus. I did have some questions, particularly for Susan and April, as to how you plan to identify your student populations for your research. Susan, I know you said as part of the conference yesterday that you were going to identify your underprepared students as how they scored on a particular test, like a placement test. And I was curious as to whether or not these students would be aware that they had been kind of tagged or labeled as underprepared students, and how you kind of plan to approach that issue with them. Similarly with April, I know you're working with multiracial students, and I didn't know if this was going to be a group that had self-identified as multiracial, or how you planned to kind of select the students that you were going to work with for your interviews or for your focus groups. I know that students from kind of diverse racial backgrounds were definitely discussed in yesterday's conference, particularly by Annie and Karen, talking about kind of some of the unique transitional issues that these students face, as well as some of the support networks that they need on campus, and some of the support systems and ways that they can be made to feel the most comfortable on campus. And so I was also curious if you were planning on incorporating some of the things that they included as their part of their panel presentations within your research. Cindy, with regard to your population of Latino dads, I was curious as to if many of these dads would be people or students with whom you had already worked. It sounded like you were planning on asking them about kind of having them evaluate the services they were receiving, the environment, whether or not they found it to be a hostile environment or a welcoming environment, and if these are students with whom you work, how honest or forthcoming you thought they might be with certain information or certain opinions or felt effects that you talk about, if you might be the person who is providing any of those services, or who may be a part of creating the environment within that they're working within. So I was curious how, again, they were going to be identified, and if this was going to be a group that you already worked with. Jen, with regard to your population, I was curious, you're working with international student athletes, and I think you may find very different results if you were working with freshman athletes versus upperclassmen athletes. The difference between a student who's been on campus for 2 months and a student who's been on here for 3 years and 2 months could be pretty different in terms of the responses they provide, and also the differences between students who have English as their first language, students from the UK, Australia, etc., versus students for whom English is not their first language and may have that language barrier, in addition to other kind of transitional issues. If you had a way that you were going to go on that, if you were going to include kind of all countries, all ages in your study, or if you plan to kind of focus it on a certain set of countries or a certain first language or a certain age group of students. Similarly, Jen, with regard to your topic, I would encourage you to maybe think about including a question about whether or not these students have previous international travel experience, whether or not they have previous experience within the United States, or living or traveling overseas, as this was something that was brought up in some of the panels yesterday, is that some of the students come with all of these wonderful preparatory experiences under their belt, whereas other students come very unprepared for what they're experiencing at college. And so I imagine it would be the same for international students, that some would come quite prepared and would have already had some wonderful international living, travel experiences under their belts that may ease their transition to campus here at UNCW. I think I'm out of time, so I'm going to stop there, but I look forward to hearing all of your comments, and I hope you all have a wonderful week. Thank you. Bye-bye.